Hey, good morning, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. I know we had a bit of snow last night, and it just seemed best with ice and everything to just change things up a bit. And wanted to give you this video and to just condense down a lot of the material we've been looking at this week, what we would have talked about in our 2-hour seminar, and give you some things to think about and ponder, to marinate on, and to prepare you for next week as well. So we're going to, at the end of this, look at what to be reading for next week and to prepare you for our seminar again in a couple weeks' time. So to get started, we're recapping what you all talked about last week in your small group with medicine and science. And as you can see on here, I wanted to do a contextual background of some of the stuff we're looking at. But also, with every seminar we have, I want to give time to follow up on lectures you've had, follow up on some of the stuff that might be going on. And this week, we really wanted to look at how the essay questions are going. Were you able to get them last week? Were there any problems? If there were, please send me an email explaining what's going on there so we can discuss that before the essay plans are due. And if you go on the LE, you'll see there in our section the dates there, all the information, just like last term. But I want to make sure you're set up for success. So one of the things I really wanted to discuss this morning was the concept of periodization. And I think this is helpful for our whole class. And now that you've had a semester of a background of information, what we're getting into, of what medieval, early modern is, those are some sort of broad periodizations. But then now we're making that sort of that pie or that cake of these areas. It's time now to make them even more bite-sized pieces, actual slices. And that's where periodization can be really useful. There's lots of articles, there's lots of discussion about periodization. There's even, controversy about how to spell it. Me from the United States, spell it with a Z, you with an S, of course, most of you. So it's worth looking into and discussing. It's something you're going to be talking about throughout your as a history major, or if you go on to grad school as well, the pros and cons of it. But there was one good article by William Green, that periodizing world history, and he says in there, gives sort of a definition, saying it's the organizing principles upon which we write history, priorities we assign to various aspects of human endeavors, and theories of change we adopt to explain historical process. Now that's a lot to take in, but what is he saying? Basically, it's just a way to help comprehend it. Now, think about that. With all the lectures you've had and talking about different things, and such a broad spectrum of time, it makes it sometimes very overwhelming. So one thing to really start working on now, and in preparation for your paper, is how to break it down into bite-sized, manageable pieces that have been constructed. Now, these are constructs. These aren't ways that people thought about them in the past, but it's for us now as modern-day historians, as historians looking at the past, how to construct a manageable way to look at the past. And there's lots of things that go into that. There's looking at worldviews, ways of life, different technological advances, different things happening in a region or in the global sphere, interactions with world systems of exchange, how they're exchanging. All those things play into this ideas of periodization. So the reason I'm bringing this up is you have your paper that you're going to be writing here, and it'd be really useful. First thing, think about the question and make yourself a little timeline of different periods that you've been talking about in this seminar, in this lectures throughout this whole year, this module from last term and this term, and start to think, okay, there's a couple different ones. Where does this particular question fit in? Is it completely in a medieval time frame? Is it completely in an early modern time frame? Does it blur between the two? And if it does, what other big events is connecting to it? So to give you an example, we're looking at science and medicine this week. So this is kind of a useful one. Let's say you're writing a paper about the history of teeth or the history of dental care. Now, if you did it as a historical perspective, you might want to use different periods to help explain it. And so this I found online, didn't make it, but it's a useful sort of way that you could start off your paper, or any way of trying to fit in and figure out how things play in history. So look at those different periods there. Now, Middle Ages, of course, we could break that into bigger bite-sized pieces. You've had a few lectures on the 12th century Renaissance, so tying in this idea of the Renaissance, of the rebirth, looking at the ancient past to make sense of the world. That's not just regulated to this time period of what we know as the Renaissance, with the Renaissance art and ideas and secularization of mind, all these things. You had a lecture a couple weeks ago that talked about that 12th century Renaissance, which is very much places that in the Middle Ages. Middle Ages themselves, of course, as you dig deep into it, can be broken up into different times. So, but these are just useful sort of brush strokes of ways of looking at periods. The Age of Enlightenment, what happens with thought, philosophy, way we reorganize political thought, way we organize science. You might want to throw in the scientific revolution in there. What about when start really exploring, Europeans start exploring the world, and China does with Cheng He and other navigational explorations around the world. We got the Age of Discovery. And of course, in the 15th century, the 16th century, you start to get a whole new way of views of looking at the world. So that plays in well in your papers. It also plays very well into this week and sort of going back to look at science and medicine again, because we have two different plagues and ways of medicine was incorporating with those plagues that fit into two different periods, don't they? So we have one looking at the 14th century, 1348, Black Death, and then you have 1665, Plague of London, which would very much fit in a whole different time period and all the things that are happening and the world views that are happening, the changes. Think about it, 1348, they didn't even know there was a Western Hemisphere. They didn't even know that there was the Americas. That was not a concept. 1665, there's a huge, completely different way of looking at the world, and there's a competition of European powers to get that new land and resources and all the information. And think about the food. We talked about Columbian exchange, that exchange of ideas, those goods, biological exchange between the Americas and the old world being Afro-Eurasia area. So that all changes, and that plays into those ideas, those periodizations that we have as historians fit into looking at what we're talking about. We're looking at the 14th century. We're looking at, this is a great picture, Peter Burdell, the elder, 16th century, but he's talking, this is often used looking at the 14th century. And if this explains it well, I always think of this as a sort of a weird Where's Waldo, where you call Where's Wally if you're from England, book. A lot of stuff going on, trying to find it. You could kind of see Wally in there, maybe, hopefully not, or Waldo if you're from the States. And the idea is that this is chaos. There's all this going on. Repercussion of the war, repercussion of famine. You could see famine being plagued. You can see this horse here. Of course, just the massive death, Black Death in the 1340s, 1348. And all these things. And one thing of looking at history is how important anxiety plays a role. Anxiety we always have anxiety, right? There's big events that come up, anxiety sprouts. Think of the 20th century. You got the Red Scare, right? This idea of communism. You have World War II. You have all the fears of anxieties of World War II, of World War I. You name it. But how people react to those anxieties makes it interesting. And you could see a lot of people's ideas, their worldviews, how they interact with each other, what their identity is, how they see others, all by how that anxiety is interactive with self and the society. Make sense? So that's what we're looking at with the Black Death, because here's this anxiety that's spreading across Afro-Eurasia, and we talked about how it spread across with different networks of exchange and making such an impact within Western Europe with these interactions, and how those anxieties of plague also coming again with 1665 that you were reading and looking at, all ways of dealing with that, and how science and medicine and those worldviews mesh together to try to react and understand what's happening with people and the massive death around them. So there's lots of ways, and you read some stuff and we were talking about in small groups, as you did, of how people made sense of that, how people tried to fix that problem, how much confidence they have to actually address the problem. And I wanted to bring up really fast some of the unusual treatments and all that. And there's lots of web pages dedicated to this. There's lots of information articles, and here in England, and all the UK for that matter, we love our treacle, and you might be drinking this by the gallons every morning, as they did in the Middle Ages, as part of some remedies. In fact, letting it almost kind of rot, go bad after a few weeks and get moldy. And some scientific evidence to show that mold, if it was a good mold, could have actually had healthful benefits to it. So people were drinking treacle back then, Theriakia, as part of a medicine that some apothecaries might have in hand for you. My favorite, though, and just to keep it short, is the Vicary method, which still, if you go to the medical school in London, they still do a yearly lecture to commemorate this awesome idea, and was pretty popular around London and England in the Black Death in 1348 and onward, is to shave a chicken's butt and stick that chicken on the infection, the wound, the pus. If you had the bubonic plague and your lymph nodes were ready to explode, you could put the chicken right on there. And the idea was that either the chicken would take the sickness out. Now, and you'd be walking around with this chicken strapped to your body. But think about it. That chicken, if it survived, it probably did get infected, and most likely did, spreading a zoonotic disease of Yersinia pestis, the Black Death, in its own way. So the chickens could spread it that way. Very interesting way of looking at it. Of course, the apothecaries made a lot of money, as you saw. We were talking about how the apothecaries making amazing remedies of all different kinds, and one more expensive one would be this emerald smoothie that they made, this emerald drink where you smash up the emeralds, put that in a drink, and drink it basically like glass shards in your stomach. So there's that. Of course, leeches tied to sort of the same mentality of bleeding out. Of course, we still use leeches today. If you see some leeches, we even use, in some cases, maggots to clean out wounds. So there's some foundational truths to some of the things that were going on in this time period as well with medicine. And then, of course, urine, trying to collect that. And you'd make quite a bit of money as apothecary selling a urine smoothie or urine to be rubbed on, as also for cleaning, which goes back to the Roman times and beyond, using that as a cleaning agent. But if you were healthy during the Black Death, you could sell your urine because you had healthy urine that the apothecaries wanted. So this picture kind of shows that these women and the men there selling the urine to help for the advancement of medicine. So some interesting ways, not to mention fecal matters being rubbed on the body. There's some cases of that as well. So very different ways of looking at it, very different ways of how to deal with it. And you read about how the different practitioners came about. So we have the physician surgeons, the barber surgeons. My favorite that we didn't really get into as well is the butcher surgeons that were often used in wartime as well because they had such a deep understanding of the anatomy, more so of animals we eat, but they were also helpful if there need to be an amputation or whatever. They had the right tools and understanding of how to deal with it. But the physicians, as you read, were ones of the higher echelons of society. They're the ones that this is the book learning aspect of medicine, but in the medieval mindset, if you're talking about the practitioners of the 14th century, right? So Galen playing a huge role, looking at ancient philosophers that have interacted with the scholastic learning of the time. And you have other sort of ideas of that time period in the learning method that would just sort of trickle into. Now, the surgeons, too, remember, they're the ones that still, same sort of thing, have a literate background. More so, you can compare them to the clerks that we looked at with the literary sort of world here. So, in sort of that class of clerks and understanding, some hands-on, some more hands-on than the physicians, but probably the most interesting that we to talk about are the apothecaries, because the apothecaries, they sort of go across all areas of society, and looking at the early modern as well, all parts of social class of the medieval and early modern Europe. And because they're making so much money, you can compare them more so to the pharmaceutical industry of today. They're the ones, especially getting quite rich off of the anxieties when plague strikes societies. So being able to make these certain potions and things. And remember too, this is a good question about gender, because 20 to 30% of them were women. When you get into the Protestant Reformation, talk about another periodization, and you start to have these fears and witch crazes that are also going on at the same time in the 17th century, you start to get a lot of focus on these apothecaries as well, and connecting some of the actions to witchcraft. So some things that in the medieval or early modern time, in the first part of the early modern era, might have seen as just natural apothecary cures and ways of looking at things and tying in zodiac signs and so forth, might be seen as more heretical witchcraft later on, as science starts to shift and become secular and power in a different direction. Something we'll talk about later. The barber surgeons that I quickly mentioned, is imagine getting your hair cut and surgery at the same time. These are people that have some training, be able to use skills, put it together. You've read about that. I mentioned the butcher surgeons, and of course everybody else. So all areas of society had ways of dealing with this. And think about across Afro-Eurasia. We're focusing on Europe in this, but this is happening as the plague struck across Afro-Eurasia, the continents here. How do you deal with it? And who's the ones in charge to have a say in this? So Al-Hwadi in Syria at this time writes also about how people were dealing with the plague, of putting clay on, and certain prayers the moms were doing in the Islamic world. Think about the different Canaanites, of how the Mongols were dealing with this as well, because it hit them as well in parts of North Africa and Egypt. Really interesting study, if this fascinates you, is looking at how this was dealt with in similar and different ways across this area. We're focusing in on Europe in your readings there quite extensively. But I think that's really interesting to see that there would be some differences across the board. Now, one thing that's similar in a lot of ways across Afro-Eurasia in different ways, especially the Islamic world, is looking at the four humors. And you read about this a bit, but I just wanted to go over very briefly. There's some great illustrations online, fascinating stuff. And if you see, connecting it also to the zodiac signs, connect it to four main parts of the body: the heart, the liver, the spleen, the brain, and the idea that balances everything. So it's about balancing them out. And if something's wrong with your body, it's an imbalance. So it's an imbalance within the heart, with air around you, maybe, right? So what you read about and what you looked at with how the toxic air, with the realigning of the planets and so forth that was talked about, would play a role and help to make an imbalance of the humors. So sometimes you might need to let some of the blood out, so you have the bloodletting. You have those leeches that we looked at. Water playing a role, of course, connected to the brain and earth, the ground, and black bile and yellow bile. All these things This would have been very understood in practitioners of the medieval and early modern time period, but something that's changed today. So if you look at and think about those four humors and then think about how that's changed in our world today, and take a minute to think about that. And in fact, write me a thing back, and I'll put this in the email. How do we conceptualize it today? What are some of the similarities of early modern and medieval time of how they dealt with these anxieties? What are the similarities? What are the differences? One big difference, just within the last 100 years, if you think about it, is the very idea of microbes. We understand now, or we think we understand, the idea of illnesses being caused by microbes and spreading from person to person. So, where in the Middle Ages, it would have been very clear for people to understand these four humors and an imbalance, and you think, oh, you're starting to get sick. Well, this part of the imbalance of the humors that's going on today, you start getting sick, you think, sanitizers. What do we do to keep those microbes down? So it's a different construct of our brain and worldviews of what we think. Now, think about 100 years from now, we might be looking back and thinking those people in the early 21st century, they just focused on those microbes. They didn't know about and whatever they come up with then. So it's interesting how this is always in flux, always changing. The anxieties of medicine and health is always there, but how you deal with it shows a lot of the time period that we're talking about. So you looked at a lot of these sources and you talked about in your small groups, and I want you to think about it a little more of how this plays in and how the time that they're in the 14th century and everything that's going on there, and the 17th century and everything that's going on there, how that affects too the views of these people you looked at. And so think about that. As we're going on, for next time, we're going to be looking at riches and poverty in depth. The next week, you're going to, in your small groups, you're going to look at that, those specific questions for each group. This is all in the LE, but you're going to be looking at what we talked about before of how networks of exchange really impact individuals and society. So think about when we talked about how this interaction across Europe, across Afro-Eurasia again, if we're talking before Age of Discovery, but then as the whole world opens up and you start to get interactions across Western Hemisphere and start bringing things back. Think about pizza in Italy would never have been pizza if they didn't have tomatoes brought in from the Americas, or potatoes and how much that revolutionized societies with caloric intake. But we're going to be looking at in the small groups how certain things that are being imported change people's views of poverty and riches, how people, outsiders, view certain areas, a Venetian traveling to London, or some wills, which is great sources to see what people value as they're holding on to them, or taxes if they have to have a death tax in some areas. So all those play a role of how the concepts of rich, poverty, and interaction with people all comes together. So I hope that helps. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. And see in the email, please email me back how to answer some of those questions that I put there, and things to think about. If looking back now on the readings you had, maybe looking at the notes on Ellie of what people said about the specific questions, the ideas of periodization, and how the periodization fits into the essay question that you chose. I'm really curious just to sort of brainstorm that and how to play that into your essay plan. You don't have to directly say it, but just understand, okay, where it fits in and how it plays out will make such a difference. So if there's any questions at all, any other concerns, please email me, let me know. I will have office hours on Tuesday next week, and of course the week after that we'll be meeting again, and I'll have lots of hours throughout that week. So happy to meet with you, discuss papers from last term for those that haven't chatted with me about that, or in preparation for the papers to come. Let's rock this. Have a fantastic weekend, and we'll be in touch. Bye-bye.